I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about an issue that we're studying here at CSIS very closely, because we have my dear friend, great friend of the podcast, President of the Defense and Security Department here at CSIS and Harold Brown Chair, Dr. Seth Jones, to talk with us about Russia's shadow war against the West. It's a new report that Seth published this week. The New York Times broke the story about Seth's report in an excellent article by Julian Barnes earlier this week. Seth, it's great to have you as always, and we really have something to talk about here in this report.
Andrew, it is always great to talk to you on this podcast. We have something big to talk about today.
All right, so what threat level does Russia currently pose to the West, and how does Russia's acts of war play a role in its foreign policy objectives?
Well, I think Russia poses several types of threats. First of all, in the conventional sphere, the act of invading with ground forces, air forces, and then naval bombardments, a country like Ukraine certainly poses a threat if you're Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, and you border either Russia itself or one of Russia's allies, such as Belarus. In addition, as we found in this report, Russia also poses a threat below the threshold of conventional war. That is in the area of what the U.S. calls irregular warfare, what many Europeans call hybrid warfare, and what the Russians, and before the Russians, the Soviets and the KGB called active measures. And that's what we're really looking at in this report, is trying to get a better understanding of what is going on.
So you're looking not at Russia's conventional tactics. You're looking at their sabotage, their subversive activities. Can you give us a sense of what those activities actually are?
Yeah, Andrew, so there are a range of them. I mean, what we did is we built a database of Russian sabotage and subversive actions that were kinetic, had some kind of effect. So what we didn't include, although we certainly noted it, is a lot of the influence, misinformation campaigns that are happening on social media platforms, or just the general routine cyber operations, including Russians involved in espionage. What we focused on are several different types, and it may be easiest for me to describe the kinds of weapons and tactics that the Russians have used.
Yeah, that'd be great.
This gives folks kind of a real good sense of what they're up to. So when it comes to weapons, we see several types. One is a lot of bombings. The highest percentage of Russian activity of bombings or incendiaries, those could also be arson of companies that are building or storing weapons or other material.
So when you say bombings, you mean like car bombs, like Molotov bombs? You don't mean like real ordnance?
Right. I mean what the Russians have generally done, and we can talk about the actors themselves and which Russian entities are involved, is placing explosives in areas like pipelines, or explosives in and around warehouses that are storing weapons going to Ukraine. So, right, they're not flying aircraft and dropping bombs on locations. They are bombing, or in some cases, torching some of these locations.
So who are these actors, these Russian actors conducting these attacks? And these are against the West, including us. And can you explain how their shadow fleet contributes to their overall plans?
Yes. So during the Cold War, since Russia and before it, the Soviet Union have been doing this for decades, it was the KGB. And against the U.S., it was generally Service A of the KGB. Today, the tip of the spear is the GRU, the main intelligence directorate, within the Ministry of Defense. There are a range of organizations within the Ministry of Defense that are involved in this kind of activity. They include a range of different military units involved. One of the main centers involved in this is what's often called the 161 Intelligence Specialist Training Center, or for short, the 161 Center. Within that, it has a number of different types of organizations that have been involved in attacks, including GRU Unit 29155. So these are GRU, Russian intelligence operatives, that are conducting these kinds of actions, or in some cases, British intelligence have spoken publicly about the Russian spies getting kicked out of a number of countries So they've relied on local assets to do it. So they've recruited individuals. Sometimes they're foreign students that have gone to study at Russian universities that they've recruited while there. Other times it may actually be Russian diaspora living in Europe itself. So those are the main types of organizations. There are a number of others that have been involved in offensive cyber operations, but the big ones are the GRU units. They have had some help from Russian foreign intelligence, the SVR, Russia's domestic intelligence agency, the FSB, and other Russian organizations. So they're generally not doing it on their own.
Are they sometimes using outside groups outside of the government? I know, they've worked with motorcycle gangs in the past. They've, all kinds of things.
Definitely. When it comes to the Russian local actors, we've seen them involved in working with and recruiting individuals belonging to European criminal organizations. In some cases, it's also been, and you mentioned this earlier, working with the Russia Shadow Fleet.
Yeah.
So these are ships, cargo ships generally, that are bringing material, sometimes illegally because it's been sanctioned, from Russia to other places. They will move through areas like the Baltic Sea and use their anchors to cut fiber optic cables.
Which is a big deal. Or in some cases to also break pipelines. So we've seen them use these kinds of informal actors, but criminal organizations, absolutely a part of it. One of the downsides for the Russians of using these kinds of organizations is that they're not always the top of the line intelligence operatives. They make mistakes, they get caught, and as we've seen in multiple countries, including in Poland, the UK, they also get prosecuted. Okay, Seth, so what are some of the biggest statistical takeaways you found throughout your research?
So there are a few. One is, let's talk about the targets. So what we found is the two largest types of targets were transportation targets. They included things like rail lines, often bringing weapons or other material from Europe into Ukraine, so through countries like Poland. Government targets, those could be individuals within the government. A minister of interior in one European case was targeted. We had the Ukrainian president Zelensky there was an assassination attempt against him. There was a Russian defector, the government that was residing in Spain under a equivalent of a witness protection program. The Russians assassinated him. There were also other kinds of government targets, U.S. military bases that were being used to train Ukrainians, including on weapon systems like M1 Abrams tanks. We saw some serious plots by the Russians against those kinds of targets. Critical infrastructure, pipelines, undersea fiber optic cables. And then one of the more interesting types of targets, Andrew, was what we called industry. So these are companies that are building material and in some cases then exporting them through Europe to Ukraine. So these are European defense companies. One of the most interesting ones we saw was there's a major plot against the CEO of Rheinmetall, which produces a number of things, including some weapons that are exported to Ukraine. This is one of the few cases we have of the Russians attempting to assassinate someone who is not a Russian defector, wasn't someone from the Russian diaspora. This was a German citizen that was targeted because of support to Ukraine. It was one of the more interesting cases that we looked at, but those are the primary areas on targets. If you were to ask me about the types of tactics, we started to talk about this earlier. The most significant percentage, about 35%, are bombings, but we also saw 27% of them are blunt or edged instruments. Think anchors, for example, that can be dragged and will break a fiber optic cable. Electronic attack, could be electronic warfare, could be GPS jamming of airplanes, could be offensive cyber attacks against a rail line meant to derail the train. And then smaller percentages, like 8%, for example, of campaigns of the weaponization of illegal immigrants. So Finland had to close its border, for example, because the Russians were pushing reasonable numbers of illegal immigrants, usually in the dead of winter, to and through Finnish border crossings with the idea to destabilize Finnish society. I mean, this was a very politically divisive issue. So the response in the weaponization of immigrants was the Finns closed the border as a response.
Seth, has your research shown that these trends are accelerating?
Yeah, the biggest single issue, Andrew, that we saw on trends is that there was a roughly tripling of the number of Russian attacks between 2023 and 2024.
Tripling.
And before that, between 2022 and 2023, the number of incidents that we identified, there was a quadrupling of it. So we've seen a dramatic expansion of Russian activity in Europe against European and U.S. targets. I think part of it, frankly, really hinges on a response to the provision of aid to Ukraine coming from Europe. As I said earlier, the Soviets and even Russia before the 2022 invasion have long been involved in these active measures. But the sheer increase in incidents, including some bombings, that's new.
And it's pretty bold indeed. For our listeners, though, I wanted you to clarify, these attacks on U.S. interests are not here in the United States. They are overseas assets that we have, correct?
Correct. The Russians have generally shied away from conducting any kind of attack in the United States.
That would be a pretty big escalation.
Even during the height of the Cold War, they generally stayed away from an attack inside of the United States. I mean, there are a few cases where some interesting and mysterious circumstances, but I'll give you one example. German prosecutors charged 3 Russian-German nationals. One of them's name was Dieter Schmidt. The other 2, the Germans did not release their last names, but the first one was Alexander J., and then the final one was Alex D. They were charged with acting as Secret Service agents for Russia and plotting bomb and arson attacks against U.S. military bases in Germany.
That's pretty serious.
It is serious. So we have the names of the individuals when we have the charges, and part of what they were involved in was just general sabotage, intelligence, and collection against bases, including U.S. bases.
So they're going to bases like Wiesbaden and Ramstein. I mean, that real U.S. stuff.
Yes. Generally, bases that had a direct connection with training Ukrainian troops. So one good example that we found in the data set is Grafenwehr, for example, where the U.S. was training Ukrainian troops to operate M1 Abrams tanks. That was a good example of the U.S. getting caught up, big plot against that base. U.S. had to go on a major state of alert around that base and several others in Europe. So not just against European targets.
All this is really remarkable, and it begs the question, what steps should the United States and other Western countries do to better deter and counter this Russian activity?
I think the first issue, just to put front and center, is there is a debate in the United States about whether Russia is a threat.
There is. I mean, I know many people have asked the question, and I know you've gotten this question, can't we just make peace with the Russians?
Right. So I think what we have to look at here is, first of all, that the Russia under Vladimir Putin is an expansionist state. If we start off in 2013, I mean, we can go much earlier than that, but illegally seizing territory in Crimea, then moving to the Donbass, first with just using Russian Spetsnaz and other intelligence units to train Ukrainian forces, and then bringing in conventional units over the course of 2014, 15, 16. Then 2022 is a full-scale invasion. So we have also seen Vladimir Putin talk about how much he is appreciative and looks highly upon Peter the Great and the great Russian Tsars that expanded the Russian Empire. Vladimir Putin is an empire builder.
Yeah.
He is interested in expanding Russian territory and Russian spheres of influence. And the way to do that is to weaken the United States and to weaken U.S. partners in areas like Europe. So first and foremost to note that the main enemy of the Soviet Union and of Russia today is the United States. It's what they call us. We are called the main enemy. We stand between Russia right now and expansion. It is also worth noting, to talk about Russia in this context, that there have been nearly 50 meetings between Putin and Xi Jinping, the leader of China. That is a very close relationship.
And public statements to that effect.
And we've seen a deepening of military ties, economic ties. We've seen a deepening of ties in the industrial base, including the defense industrial base, sensitive areas like intelligence sharing, space, cyber. There is no Kissinger moment today. The United States is not going to be able to break a Beijing-Moscow axis. Kissinger didn't either. He took advantage of a break between the Chinese and the Russians. So I think it's worth highlighting that right now. What the U.S. and NATO have done is largely play defense. They try to collect intelligence on what the Russians are doing. They've conducted some surveillance missions. NATO has established what it calls Baltic Sentry to protect underwater cables and pipelines through the patrol of frigates, maritime patrol aircraft, submarines, remotely operated vehicles and other drones, surveillance assets. So these are all defensive measures. There have been a few what you might call offensive actions, kicking out Russian spies. But for the most part, we haven't seen costs. We haven't seen much in the way of like increasing sanctions against the Russians, or we haven't seen them do things like take proactive steps against the shadow fleet, boarding vessels that are up to no good in areas like the Baltic Sea. We haven't seen much in the way of offensive cyber operations. In fact, there has been some discussions potentially of the U.S. considering pulling back on offensive cyber operations. In order for this to stop, the U.S. and NATO, which have been the recipients of this, really have to start imposing some costs.
Seth, I want to ask you also about misinformation as a tactic. We know that Russia has waged misinformation. We know they've tried to impact our elections. What's the status of their misinformation warfare efforts at this point?
It's pervasive. It's pervasive across Europe. It's pervasive across the United States. And it's pervasive across most every region of the country and on cyberspace. Again, the objective of the Kremlin is to take steps to weaken the United States, weaken Western countries, and to expand Russian power and influence, including with Russia's predominant global partner, which is China. And I think that is first and foremost what is behind Russian disinformation and misinformation operations, and what has been a historical objective in active measures. It's weakening us in particular, and also driving fissures between the United States and its major allies and partners.
Seth, I think I know the answer to this, but is a more aggressive approach needed from the U.S. and our European allies?
Absolutely. Russia needs to feel some pain if it continues to operate and conduct these kinds of actions. And I think there is really no other way to deter or coerce countries that are conducting these kinds of actions than not just to play defense, but to make them feel some pain for doing it. Andrew, one of the things that's interesting, we also plotted where these attacks were occurring across Europe. Not surprising that the countries that are providing the most assistance to Ukraine, Poland, the UK, even France, including some of NATO's most recent members, Finland, Sweden, they're all getting hit hard.
They're the ones being most targeted.
Yes. We found not a single case in Hungary, Russia's close ally,
Right.
Not a single case in Serbia. So what it looks like is that Russia is making very deliberate decisions on who it's targeting and who is left out.
Seth, it's a fascinating report. You can find it on CSIS's website. It's called Understanding Russia's Shadow War Against the West. I highly recommend it. Seth, thank you again for all this really terrific stuff.
Andrew, as always, thank you so much. This is the best podcast out there.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.